Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. lawmg.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. Warm weather over the past few weeks may have dried up the soil on Indiana farms, but farmers and their suppliers are still reeling from the blow of heavy rains and flooding.
So this is a perfect look of what was first try and second try, or plan A, plan B, plan C, D, E.
Pharmaceutical companies and distributors are now in the crosshairs of states who want help paying for the devastating effects of the opioid crisis. And more kids are hearing about firearm sports in high schools as part of a national push to expand the world of clay target shooting.
It's growing quickly in Indiana. It's the fastest growing sport we have in America as we understand it in the high school systems.
Shooting sport officials hope to recruit a new generation of sharpshooters to keep the culture alive. Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. Well, people are using words like crisis, unprecedented, and disaster to describe the situation many Midwestern farmers are in this year. The United States Department of Agriculture estimates over 500,000 acres in Indiana are unplanted because of the wet spring, and that number is expected to rise. And the trouble extends beyond just farmers. The suppliers they rely on are also feeling the effects of this spring's unusually high number of rainy days. As Brock Turner reports, the impacts are far-reaching and could even impact the communities they call home.
Seasons like this test Jeff Demmerle's patience.
It's very rare to have this barn with much product left of anything. So most of the corn and the pallets and boxes and some of the stuff that's laying around today is all sent back.
Usually this time of the year, he's cleaning out his storage barn. But this year, it's different. He still has dozens of pallets of corn seed that were supposed to be planted over a month ago, and bags of soybeans are stacked nearly to the ceiling. Demmerle runs a seed and fertilizer business. When farmers can't get into their fields to plant, they don't need to buy seed or fertilizer.
It basically made us develop plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D, and sometimes we were on to plan E and F with a lot of inventory and management and moving stuff out the door.
Demmerle plans to return much of his inventory to the manufacturer, so he won't be out the cost, just the profit he would have made on each bag. Surveying fields here in White County, many of them are at least planted, but the way they look varies significantly.
So this is a perfect look of what was first try and second try, or plan A, plan B, plan C, D, E. You know, so this was a chance where the grower was able to get back in and replant what was water damaged.
Now it's a waiting game. The director at Purdue University's Center for Commercial Agriculture, Jim Mintert, says crop yields will almost certainly not be as good as usual because of the delays farmers endured trying to get their crops into the ground. He says that will impact ethanol plants, grain elevators, and livestock operations later this fall, who all rely on grain.
The dominant impact is, first of all, on farmers. Then the secondary impact is on those input suppliers. But as you kind of point out, a number of those input suppliers do more than just sell the good. They actually help in terms of providing equipment, in some cases providing someone that comes out and actually applies an input to a field.
Those suppliers include Joshua Pollard. Pollard manages the applications of fertilizer and other chemicals for farmers across the Midwest at Sellersburg, Indiana-based AgMax Helicopter. This spring's wet weather has forced his company to abandon its usual timelines. He says business increased earlier in the season with farmers using the helicopter to do work they'd normally do themselves.
It was still too wet to get over the top of the ground with the ground rig, so they had to call in the aerial assault in order to just get the normal job done that normally is pretty easy. Basically everything we do relies on farmers, and so if they're impacted, then we're impacted.
While the beginning of the season presented an opportunity for Pollard's company, the continued rain and flooding means his business will suffer in the long run.
But ultimately, long term, now that we're starting to spray, I think our numbers are going to be impacted negatively. Just because there's fewer fields planted, maybe half the fields drowned out. I really think acres are going to be down.
But more than just businesses that sell to farmers will be impacted. Minchard believes the communities that rely on agriculture will feel the effects too.
In some rural communities, Main Street's going to be affected in the sense that as people pull back, you're going to see some impact on, for example, retailers and non-ag businesses in rural communities. That's probably not going to be the case in the major metro centers, obviously, as we move around Indiana. But in some of those more rural counties that are more heavily dependent on production agriculture, the spillover impacts could extend beyond the ag input suppliers and the output firms.
If there is a bright spot, it could be that the average consumer won't see much of an impact on their grocery bills. Prices aren't expected to increase significantly. Minchard says that's because the past several years, farmers have produced more grain than what the market can absorb. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Brock Turner.
Now for headlines, we go over to Barbara Brosier, who has the latest on this week's top stories.
Thanks, Joe. A Bloomington juvenile accused of stabbing and choking a 13-year-old acquaintance at a Jacobs School of Music building last month is out on house arrest after posting bail in Monroe County this week. 17-year-old Dong-wook Mikey Ko will remain on GPS-monitored house arrest as he awaits trial. At a bail hearing last week, Ko's mother requested that his bail be reduced so she could use the money to admit him to Bloomington Meadows Hospital, a mental health facility. Indiana's legislative leaders have hired an outside attorney to represent the General Assembly in a federal lawsuit against State Attorney General Curtis Hill. A state lawmaker and 3 legislative staffers sued Hill and the state last month, accusing Hill of groping them at an Indianapolis bar and accusing him of sexual harassment and defamation. The Indiana Attorney General typically represents state agencies and offices in lawsuits, but State House leaders say that option isn't workable in this case. Hill has refused to resign despite calls from the governor and other state officials to do so. The group that investigated animal cruelty at Fair Oaks Farms has now released a video from Natural Prairie Dairy. As Tyler Lake reports, activists with Animal Recovery Mission, or ARM, hope to prevent the company from opening a farm in Indiana.
ARM founder Richard Kudo says, among other things, cows at Natural Prairie Dairy's location in Texas were kicked, separated from their calves, and despite being grass-fed, they rarely got outside. He says just because a confined animal feeding operation is organic doesn't mean the cows are treated better.
They think of cows living in green pastures for all their lives, sitting and standing by their calf, which now you know this does not exist.
Kudo says some of what's shown in the video are standard practices in the dairy industry.
It is a standard practice, correct?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that it's comfortable for the animal.
Last month, ARM released an undercover video showing workers at Fair Oaks Farms abusing animals at the Indiana facility. Charges were brought against one worker at the time. Natural Prairie Dairy's planned farm in Newton County is already controversial. It will be on the site of a dried-up lake near a former marsh. Some residents worry waste from the farm would pollute drinking water and natural areas nearby. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Tyler Lake.
And that Fair Oaks farm worker who was arrested last month for animal abuse is in federal immigration custody. A spokesperson for Immigration and Customs Enforcement says the Mexican national will remain in ICE custody based on accusations that he's in the country illegally. He's one of 3 former Fair Oaks Farms employees accused of abusing calves at the facility. 5 Terre Haute Penitentiary inmates will be executed soon, 3 of them in December. It's the first time the U.S. government has executed federal death row inmates since 2003. In 2014, then President Barack Obama directed the department to conduct a review of capital punishment following a botched state execution in Oklahoma. The department says that review has been completed, clearing the way for executions to resume. An attorney representing two couples who are suing a Spencer gun range asked a judge to speed up the evidence gathering process. The couples filed suit against Precision Gun Range in Owen County after the zoning board voted to allow the range to operate despite reported safety issues. It had been closed after neighbors living behind the range said their home was hit by bullets. State officials say people are drowning at a higher rate this year compared to last year. The 34 drownings in public waterways this year exceeded last year's number. At the same time, according to the Department of Natural Resources, there were 53 drownings in Indiana waterways last year. Officials say none of those who drowned were wearing life jackets. The DNR advises people to wear life jackets, go swimming with someone, and avoid flooded or fast-moving waterways. The developer of Westfield's Grand Park Sports Complex is planning a $77 million youth sports and commercial development in Kokomo. The proposed championship park would include 8 multi-purpose fields, office, retail, and restaurant space, along with new hotels. Mayor Greg Goodnight says nearby residents haven't voiced concerns about the new development.
So far so good with the neighborhood support. I think they should be, like most people, should be happy that this is, some private investment going in their vicinity.
The proposal would require an investment from the city of about $9 million. Kokomo leaders plan to create a tax district to generate the necessary funding. Goodnight says discussions are taking place now on whether the facility will be managed by the Parks Department or a third-party vendor. Construction is expected to begin this fall. Monroe County commissioners issued a memo this week to officials to form a working group to iron out a budget for the convention center expansion. Bloomington Mayor John Hamilton recently said he was frustrated with the delay in getting a new memorandum of understanding from the county. But county officials point to a recent report that shows the cost of the development has nearly doubled. Ongoing disagreements between the city and county about their roles in the project continue to cause delays. The Indiana Gaming Commission is accepting applications for a Vigo County casino. State legislators approved a gaming bill earlier this year that makes a Gary casino give up one of its licenses for a new Vigo County casino. The commission can't take action on any of the proposals until after Vigo County voters decide whether to allow a casino to open in their community. That question will appear on the ballot in November. And Paoli Peaks could be under new ownership. Vail Resorts plans to take over 17 U.S. ski areas ranging from the Northeast to the Midwest by acquiring Peak Resorts, the owner of Indiana's Paoli Peaks. The sale is worth $264 million. Vail says it plans to spend about $15 million over the next 2 years on improvements at the properties. It's unclear how the purchase will affect Paoli Peaks Peak Pass holders. Vail owns 20 other ski areas in the U.S., Canada, and Australia. And Joe, it'll be interesting to see what, if any, changes there are for Paoli Peaks as a result of this potential sale.
Sure. I don't know about you. I'm not ready for snow yet either.
No, we'll stick with summer for a little bit longer.
Thanks, Barbara. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. Sports shooting enthusiasts are working to pull more students into trap shooting in order to grow bigger teams and teach young people how to safely handle firearms. And it's not hard to find a great orchestral performance in Bloomington, but how does it stack up against other cities? As part of our City Limits series, we go in search of an answer. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The WTIU WFIU news team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU WFIU news team is where you are and telling your story.
In a time of change, where can you find in-depth reporting and thoughtful analysis? Washington Week on PBS. Join moderator Robert Costa.
When I was at the Capitol this week, I encountered the same.
And a panel of award-winning journalists.
You're seeing a divided nation, and you're seeing.
For insights and perspective.
Tonight there was a key development in the Senate.
You won't find anywhere else.
What a week.
Washington Week.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. Well, after 2 decades and 200,000 deaths across the country, nearly every state in the union is demanding that the firms who profited from the opioid crisis be forced to pay to help bring it to an end. Now, 2 cases are taking center stage, but dozens more are set to follow. Attorneys in the cases are hoping to see a deal sometime this year. The epidemic has hit the state of Indiana hard. According to the DEA, well over 2 billion prescription pain pills were provided to the state over a 6-year period between 2006 and 2012. Now, with us to discuss the latest with these lawsuits is Nicholas Terry, the executive director of the Hall Center for Law and Health. Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be here, Joe.
So I wanted to start about those 2 cases we talked about that right now against firms that profited from the opioid crisis. Can you tell us a little bit about those 2 cases?
Sure. There are sort of 2 sets. The first set are federal cases that have sort of been joined together and stuck in a courtroom in Cleveland, Ohio, under the control of one judge. And there are about 2,000 plaintiffs in that case, including many Indiana counties, the city of Indianapolis, and so on. That case is proceeding very slowly. There's likely to be what's called a bellwether or test case in Cleveland sometime in October or a little bit later. And the second set of cases are cases being brought by the states in their own state courts. Again, Indiana has filed, and probably the most famous one that you've probably read about in the papers is the one going on in Oklahoma, which is just wrapped up over the last couple of days, but we don't have a result yet.
So what do you expect to come from these 2 cases?
Well, I think everybody understands that the manufacturers and the distributors, and there are many of them, do owe some responsibility here. What we're haggling over is the price. Settlement is likely. We've seen a lot of settlements going around the states, but there are lots of holes in the plaintiff cases. It's very hard to figure out just what damages are appropriate. So there's still a long way to go in the negotiations, but I would expect some kind of breakthrough in Cleveland fairly soon.
Now, how do these lawsuits compare to these big tobacco company lawsuits that we've been seeing?
Well, there are a couple of similarities, a couple of differences. I mean, the big difference is that no one ever believed tobacco was good for you, well, at least not in our lifetimes. Yeah. Whereas opioids are a Federal Drug Administration approved medicine that many of us will need at various times. It's very difficult to see that we would want to stop all opioids. As far as the money, $250 billion the tobacco companies have paid out or are paying out over time. I expect the opioid settlement to be more around the $100 billion mark, but it's still very early to tell.
We just have a few seconds left, but do you see this kind of affecting any of the victims or helping them in any way?
Well, that really is the $64,000 or maybe the $100 billion
right.
question,
Yeah.
isn't it? In the tobacco cases, a lot of the money just got swept up by the states into their general revenue. So it's very important this time, I think, that we all ask for any monies that are collected to be put into treatment and recovery centers and expand the workforce for dealing with addictions generally.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for being here today. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Well, more kids are hearing about guns while they're in school, but not because of school safety. Coaches and firearm enthusiasts in Indiana are joining a national trend by recruiting more kids for trap shooting teams. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Jeannie Lindsay reports shooting sport enthusiasts say they want to expand the sport to show more people a positive side of firearm use.
Allie Fulp and Levi Dodson live down the street from each other and compete all the time. They're in Levi's yard shooting at the clay targets Allie's dad sends whipping through the air. The sound of gunfire isn't uncommon here. The 2 high schoolers have been target shooting for years. They're both figuring out where they want to go to college. Levi could go to one of the best marine biology schools in the country with his grades. But he and Allie have another focus beyond academics, a school with a trap shooting team.
One of the colleges that I've been looking at recently actually has a competitive shotgun team. which I thought would be really cool.
Fulp and Dodson are part of a high school-sanctioned clay target team. School-backed teams are a growing trend in Indiana and across the country. The Indiana High School Clay Target League started 3 years ago with one team. This year, there are 15. Shooting teams already exist in clubs like 4-H and Boy Scouts, but data shows gun owners tend to be older, white, and male. And Dodson and Fulp's coach for the Lapel High School trap team, John Beeman, says growth is how shooting sports will survive.
We want to expand that so it doesn't go away. So like the club we're in here now, you got a lot of senior members here.
And to do it, he and others like him are recruiting more kids in high schools. Beeman says to create a ripple effect.
What I'm hoping happens is that this little nucleus of kids, goes out and multiplies a little bit with their friends, and then that someone in that school takes the initiative, a parent or a coach or teacher, to say, hey, we want a league here in this school.
At practice, shooters take turns in different positions. When it's their turn to fire, they yell, pull, and a machine in the ground flings a clay target, also called a bird, across the sky. The shooter scores if they hit and break the target while it's flying through the air, and that's just the basic version. Brad Mendenhall directs the state's Scholastic Clay Target Program. He says the effort to draw in more kids is nationwide, and it's working.
It's growing quickly in Indiana. It's the fastest growing sport we have in America as we understand it in the high school systems.
Some people are hesitant about that growth. A league official says at least one school in Indiana backed out of starting a team after the Noblesville Middle School shooting last spring. But safety drives how coaches and officials talk about the sport. Mendenhall says for every young shooter, safety is the first and a constant conversation.
Ultimately, it's responsibility. They're very responsible kids. Last year, we fired 2.1 million rounds in Marengo, Ohio, without one incident.
And millions of one-time use rounds are expensive. The gun business makes money from every fired shot and shattered clay target. The National USA Clay Target League highlights the potential spending power of the students it reaches. It describes its target audience as young shooting sport enthusiasts ready to purchase. But before trap shooting kids become spenders, other groups help pay the bills. The nonprofit arm of the NRA, Friends of NRA, fundraised more than $1 million in Indiana last year for shooting sports. Support from the NRA nonprofit causes tension too, but Beeman says it's not about politics, and he's happy to show people what it does for kids on his team.
Come out and shoot with us. Come to the club, come see the kids, interact with them, and then you tell me if this is a worthwhile endeavor or not.
And for one of the state's top sharpshooters, Allie Fulp, growing the sport is worth it, especially if it means recruiting more girls for some friendly competition.
The guys definitely underestimate the girls, definitely. I hope that they remember that we can still beat them. We can beat them hard.
And with her sights set on the Junior Olympics, she plans to. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Jeannie Lindsay.
Trap shooting officials also say efforts are underway to open a path to the Olympics in Indiana. The sport has suffered from a lack of U.S. representation in men's shooting since the 2008 Olympics. Mendenhall says training facilities across the country still need to catch up with changes made at the international level, but the organization, USA Shooting, is hoping for a comeback in 2020. Well, resident Paul Smedberg thinks Bloomington is a special place for music. He asked City Limits if the city could have the highest number of orchestras per capita in the nation or even the world. Now, we have to admit we couldn't find a solid answer, but neither could we find a reason to believe Smedberg wasn't onto something.
Bloomington doesn't show up well on the lists kept by big orchestra associations, and they don't keep per capita data. Wikipedia says Bloomington doesn't have any orchestras, and we know that's not true.
I use Jacobs School of Music as the major reason Bloomington, a city with a population of only about 85,000, can claim 12 or more orchestras. Jacobs has 8. Bloomington also has the Bloomington Symphony Orchestra and high school orchestras, including the Hoosier Youth Philharmonic. That combined group of Bloomington High School North and South musicians has played at Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center. Smedberg wondered if Rochester, New York might compete with Bloomington for the per capita title because of the Eastman School of Music. But with a population more than twice that of Bloomington, Rochester would have to have more than twice the number of orchestras to match it per capita, which is unlikely. Beyond the U.S., Vienna has at least a dozen professional orchestras and who knows how many youth and amateur ensembles. But with nearly 2 million people, Vienna would have to have 282 orchestras to match Bloomington per capita.
So while we can't say that Bloomington has more orchestras per capita than anywhere else in the nation and world, we also can't say that it doesn't. We can only conclude that Bloomington has a thriving and growing orchestra community.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Bob Salzberg.
That's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. LawMG.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. Alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. Rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.